August 15, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. Across America, celebrations erupted in every city and town. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square, factory workers who had built warplanes wept with relief, and families hung flags from their windows knowing their sons would finally come home. But at Camp McCoy in western Wisconsin, American military officials faced something completely unprecedented. They were about to receive prisoners that almost no one in the United States military had prepared for. Female Japanese prisoners of war. These weren't ordinary civilians. They were members of the Japanese Women's Volunteer Corps, captured during the final chaotic weeks of the Pacific War. Young women who had served the emperor in various capacities, now being transported thousands of miles from everything they had ever known, to a country they had been taught to fear and hate. Before we discover what happened when these women encountered American abundance, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 3 days after the emperor's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. In a makeshift processing center in occupied Okinawa, American officials debated what to do with 47 captured Japanese women ranging in age from 19 to 38. Unlike male POWs who could be housed in existing camps, these women presented unique challenges. Where would they be held? Who would guard them? What protocols existed for enemy women who had actively served in military support roles? Major Robert Chen of the Army's Prisoner of War Operations Division remembered the confusion vividly. He later wrote in his official report that the women stood in formation despite their obvious exhaustion, maintaining the rigid discipline they had been trained to display. They wore remnants of their volunteer course uniforms, dark Monpi work pants, and plain jackets, many torn and stained from weeks of chaos as the Japanese military collapsed around them. Among these women was 23-year-old Akiko Tanaka from Hiroshima. She had joined the Women's Volunteer Corps in 1943, working as a radio operator and translator. Fluent in English from her years at a missionary school before the war, she had believed she was serving her country's sacred defense. Now, standing in an American processing line, she clutched a small cloth bundle containing the only possessions she had left. A wooden comb her mother had given her, a faded photograph of her family, and a notebook where she had been documenting everything that had happened since the surrender. The American soldiers processing the women showed a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. These were enemy combatants, yes, but they were also clearly terrified young women far from home. Corporal James Rodriguez, assigned to help coordinate the transport, noticed how the women refused to make eye contact with any of the American personnel. They moved mechanically through each station, their faces masks of resignation and fear. One young woman, barely 20 years old, trembled so violently that she could barely hold the pen to sign her processing documents. The Americans had been told these Japanese women expected to be executed or worse. The 47 women boarding the transport ship in Okinawa represented a cross-section of Japan's desperate final mobilization. They had come from different prefectures, different social classes, and different circumstances, but all had answered their country's call when the Women's Volunteer Corps expanded its recruitment in the war's final years. Their stories revealed how deeply the war had reached into every corner of Japanese society. Akiko Tanaka had been one of the privileged few. Educated at a Christian missionary school in Hiroshima, she spoke English fluently and had been raised with exposure to Western culture. Her father, a professor at Hiroshima University, had encouraged her education despite the militaristic atmosphere of wartime Japan. When she volunteered in 1943, it was partly from genuine patriotic duty and partly to protect her family from accusations of disloyalty due to their Western connections. She worked as a radio operator and translator, monitoring Allied communications and helping decode messages. Yuki Nakamura, 26 years old, came from a farming family in rural Kyushu. She had joined the Corps to escape an arranged marriage and to earn money to send home to her struggling parents. Assigned to work in a military supply depot, she spent her days organizing equipment and maintaining inventory records. She had never traveled more than 50 miles from her village before the war swept her into service. Now she found herself on a ship bound for America, a place she had only heard about in propaganda broadcasts, describing it as a land of demons and barbarians. Emiko Sato, 32 years old, was the oldest among them and carried herself with the bearing of someone who had held responsibility. A widow whose husband had been killed at Guadalcanal, she had volunteered as a way to honor his sacrifice and to find purpose after his death. She worked as a nurse's aide in a military hospital, caring for wounded soldiers returning from the Pacific Islands. She had seen the cost of war in the broken bodies and shattered minds of young men who would never fully recover. Unlike some of the younger women, Emiko harbored no illusions about Japanese victory. She had known for months that defeat was inevitable. The transport ship's journey across the Pacific took 17 days. The women were confined to a converted cargo hold that had been hastily fitted with bunks and basic sanitation facilities. American guards, unsure how to interact with female enemy prisoners, maintained professional distance. Meals were delivered 3 times daily, simple rations of rice, canned vegetables, and occasionally fish. The portions were small but regular, which the women noted with surprise. They had expected starvation rations or worse. During the voyage, Akiko began speaking cautiously with some of the guards who patrolled outside their quarters. Her English, rusty from disuse, slowly returned. She asked careful questions about where they were going and what would happen to them. The guards, young men who seemed almost as uncertain as the prisoners, offered vague reassurances that they would be treated according to international law. The women's first glimpse of America came on a gray September morning as their transport ship entered San Francisco Bay. Through the small portholes in their quarters, they could see the Golden Gate Bridge emerging from the fog, its massive towers unlike anything they had ever seen. The scale of it contradicted everything they had been told about American poverty and weakness. This was not the struggling, desperate enemy their propaganda had described. From San Francisco, they were transferred to a train for the journey to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. The train ride became their first real exposure to American abundance. Through the windows, they saw vast farmlands heavy with crops, towns that showed no signs of bombing damage, and people going about their lives as if war had never touched them. Yuki pressed her face against the glass, unable to comprehend how much food must exist in those endless fields. In Japan, every available plot of land had been converted to growing sweet potatoes and vegetables to combat starvation. Here, she saw corn and wheat stretching to the horizon. The train stopped briefly in Chicago to change engines. During the stop, American civilians gathered on the platform to stare at the unusual cargo of Japanese women prisoners. Some faces showed hostility and anger. Many Americans had lost sons, brothers, and husbands to Japanese forces, but others displayed simple curiosity, trying to reconcile their image of brutal enemy soldiers with these exhausted young women peering nervously from behind barred windows. One elderly woman actually waved, a gesture so unexpected that several of the prisoners instinctively bowed in response before catching themselves. Camp McCoy appeared on the horizon on September 8, 1945. The facility sprawled across hundreds of acres of Wisconsin countryside, originally built to house German and Italian prisoners earlier in the war. As the trucks carrying the Japanese women pulled through the main gates, they saw rows of barracks, administrative buildings, and guard towers. But what struck them most was how clean and orderly everything appeared. This didn't match their expectations of what a prison camp should look like. Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the Japanese women's section, stood waiting as they disembarked from the trucks. She had spent the previous week preparing for their arrival, reading every available document about Japanese culture and trying to anticipate problems. What she saw stepping down from those trucks surprised her. These weren't the fanatical warriors American propaganda had portrayed. They were frightened young women trying desperately to maintain dignity in the face of complete uncertainty. The women were led to a separate section of the camp that had been hastily designated for female prisoners. Barracks that had previously housed Italian officers now held rows of simple bunks with thin mattresses and wool blankets. It wasn't comfortable, but it was clean and weatherproof. Emiko ran her hand along one of the bunks. The first full day at Camp McCoy began at 6 in the morning with a wake-up call that sent the women scrambling from their bunks. They dressed quickly in the plain gray uniforms they had been issued, trying to form some semblance of the military order they had been trained to maintain. Breakfast was served at 7, and nothing could have prepared them for what awaited in the mess hall. The dining facility was a large wooden building with long tables and benches. American guards directed the Japanese women to their designated section, separated from the rest of the camp population, but within the same building. What shocked them wasn't the segregation, which they had expected, but the food. Each woman received a metal tray loaded with portions that seemed impossible: scrambled eggs, thick slices of toast with butter, strips of bacon, and a cup of coffee with sugar and cream available on the tables. The amount of food on a single tray exceeded what many of them had eaten in an entire day back in Japan during the war's final months. Akiko stared at her tray, convinced there had been some mistake. She looked around at the other women, seeing the same confusion and disbelief reflected on their faces. Yuki actually counted the pieces of bacon on her plate, 3 thick strips, more meat than she had seen in weeks. The eggs alone would have been a luxury. The butter, real butter, not the ersatz substitute they had used in Japan, seemed like something from a dream. They ate slowly, almost reverently, expecting at any moment for guards to snatch the trays away and reveal this had been some cruel joke, but nothing happened. The guards simply stood at their posts, looking bored. Other prisoners, male POWs in different sections of the hall, ate their portions with casual indifference, some even leaving food on their plates. That last observation shocked the Japanese women more than anything else. Americans were wasting food, leaving perfectly good eggs and toast uneaten, as if they didn't matter. Lunch brought another shock: sandwiches made with real ham and cheese, fresh apples, and cookies for dessert. The cookies alone, sweet and rich with butter, seemed like something reserved for holidays or special occasions. Emiko wrapped her apple in a napkin and tucked it into her uniform pocket, unable to believe such abundance would continue. Several other women did the same, hoarding food against the inevitable return to scarcity. Dinner that first day consisted of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie. The portions remained generous, almost overwhelming. The women ate in stunned silence, each lost in her own attempts to understand what this meant. Was this special treatment because they had just arrived? Were the Americans trying to fatten them up for some purpose? Or was this perhaps a celebration of some kind that they didn't understand? That night in the barracks, the women gathered in small groups to discuss the mystery. September 23, 1945. 2 weeks had passed since the Japanese women arrived at Camp McCoy, and the abundance of food had not diminished. Every single day brought 3 full meals that would have seemed like festival fare in wartime Japan. The women had stopped trying to hide food in their pockets, though many still ate with the rapid efficiency of people who expected their plates to be taken away at any moment. But nothing prepared them for what appeared on their trays that Thursday afternoon. The mess hall filled with the smell of grilling meat, a rich aroma that drew curious looks from the Japanese women as they filed in for lunch. When they reached the serving line, each woman received something they had never seen before: a large sandwich consisting of a thick beef patty on a soft white bun, topped with cheese that was still melting, lettuce, tomato, and strange red sauce. Beside this sat a mound of golden fried potatoes cut into strips. The American servers called it hamburger and fries. speaking the English words as if this was the most ordinary meal imaginable. Akiko accepted her tray with trembling hands. The hamburger alone was larger than her fist. The beef patty had to weigh at least a quarter pound, more meat than her entire family might have shared in a week during the final year of the war. The fries overflowed from their section of the tray, dozens of perfectly fried potato strips glistening with salt. She looked around at the other women, seeing her own shock reflected in their faces. This had to be a special occasion, the emperor's birthday perhaps, or some American holiday they didn't know about. Yuki sat down at the long table and simply stared at her tray. Growing up on her family's farm, she had raised sweet potatoes in every available space, struggling to produce enough to meet the military's quotas while keeping her family from starvation. Here sat more potatoes than she could eat, fried in what must have been precious oil, seasoned with salt that had been worth its weight in gold back home. And they were just a side dish to the massive amount of meat. She touched the hamburger bun, finding it soft and fresh, made with white flour instead of the sawdust extended bread that had become standard in Japan. Emiko bit into her hamburger and had to close her eyes. The beef was seasoned and cooked perfectly, juicy and rich. The cheese added a creamy saltiness she had almost forgotten food could have. The vegetables were crisp and fresh, each element combined into something that transcended mere sustenance. This was food as pleasure, as abundance, as proof of a world where people didn't have to count every grain of rice or ration every bite. Tears ran down her cheeks as she chewed, overwhelmed by the realization of how much they had lost, how much they had suffered, and how completely they had been lied to about their enemy. The other women ate in silence, most fighting similar emotions. Several were crying openly, unable to process the contrast between this meal and everything they had experienced. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the mess hall, watching the Japanese women's reaction to their lunch. She had noticed their behavior around food from the first day, the way they ate with intense focus, the hoarding that had gradually decreased but never fully stopped, and now this overwhelming emotional response to a simple hamburger and fries. Something was clearly happening that went beyond ordinary prisoner adjustments to camp life, and she needed to understand what. After lunch, she approached Akiko, who had been identified as one of the few prisoners with English language skills. The young Japanese woman stood quickly when the captain approached, bowing deeply in the formal manner Sarah had learned indicated respect and deference. Sarah gestured for her to sit, pulling up a chair across from her at the otherwise empty table. She spoke slowly and clearly, unsure how much Akiko would understand. "I noticed you and the other women seemed upset during lunch. Is something wrong with the food?" Sarah asked, genuinely concerned that perhaps the hamburgers had violated some dietary restriction she wasn't aware of. Akiko looked down at her hands, struggling to find English words for something that felt too large to express. Finally, she spoke in halting but clear English. "Captain, we must ask, what is the special day today? What celebration are Americans having?" Sarah's confusion was evident. "Special day? There's no special day. Today is just Thursday, September 23rd. Why do you ask?" Akiko's eyes widened slightly. She glanced over at the other women who were watching this conversation intently from across the room. When she looked back at Sarah, her expression held something between disbelief and desperation. "The food, Captain. So much food. The hamburger with so much meat. In Japan, this food would be for Emperor's birthday or New Year celebration. We thought Americans were celebrating something important, but you say this is just Thursday?" Understanding dawned on Sarah's face, followed immediately by a wave of compassion for what these women had experienced. She leaned forward, speaking gently but firmly. "Akiko, this is normal food. What you ate today, what you've been eating every day since you arrived, this is what American soldiers eat every day. There's no special occasion. This is just lunch." Akiko sat very still, processing this information. Her hands gripped the edge of the table as if she needed to hold on to something solid, while her understanding of reality shifted beneath her. "Every day," she repeated slowly. "Americans eat like this every day. Even during the war," Sarah nodded. "Even during the war. We had rationing for some things. Sugar and butter were limited. Meat had restrictions. But yes, most Americans ate well throughout the war. We had enough." The words hung in the air between them. Enough. Such a simple concept, yet it represented everything the Japanese women had been denied. That evening, Akiko gathered the other women in the barracks to share what Captain Mitchell had told her. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of deception they had all lived under. Each woman had been fed the same lies through different channels: government radio broadcasts, military briefings, school lessons, and community meetings. All had painted the same picture of America as a weak, desperate nation on the verge of collapse. Yuki spoke first, her voice quiet but firm. "They told us Americans were starving, that their farms had failed, and their people were eating grass and tree bark to survive. They said this was why America wanted to conquer Asia, to steal our rice and resources, because they had nothing left." She paused, remembering the endless propaganda broadcasts in her village. "They showed us pictures of breadlines from the American Depression and said this was happening everywhere in America during the war." Emiko nodded, adding her own memories. "At the hospital, officers told us that American soldiers were poorly equipped and malnourished. They said the Americans sent their weakest men to fight because they had no strong men left. We were told to expect easy victory because the Americans would surrender when they ran out of supplies." She laughed bitterly at the memory. "I believed it. We all believed it. Why wouldn't we? We had no other information." Another woman, Keiko Yamamoto, a former factory worker from Osaka, shared her experience. "In the factories, they told us we were outproducing America 10-1. They said American factories were staffed by lazy workers who barely knew how to operate their machines. We worked 16-hour shifts, being told that our superior Japanese work ethic would win the war." She gestured toward the window, toward the vast American landscape they had seen from the train. "But I saw their factories from the train. I saw their cities untouched by bombs. I saw their farms heavy with crops. Everything was a lie." Akiko pulled out her notebook, the one she had been keeping since the surrender. She had been documenting everything, trying to make sense of the gap between what she had been taught and what she was experiencing. "I studied at a missionary school," she said. "I learned English from American teachers. Before they were forced to leave Japan, I read American books and magazines. I thought I understood something about America." Her voice grew heavy with regret. "But even I believed the propaganda when the war started. They told us the missionaries were spies. They said the books were lies designed to make us weak. They convinced us that everything we had learned from Americans was part of a plot to destroy Japan." The women sat in silence, each confronting the realization that their suffering had been unnecessary, that they had fought for lies, that their families had starved while their leaders told them their enemy was starving worse. The hamburger had become a symbol, undeniable proof that everything they had sacrificed had been based on deception. Corporal James Rodriguez had been watching the Japanese women with growing concern. The 24-year-old from San Antonio had seen combat in the Pacific, had fought Japanese soldiers on Okinawa, and had every reason to harbor hatred toward these prisoners. His best friend had died on that island, killed by a sniper in the final weeks of fighting, but something about these women reminded him uncomfortably of his own sisters and mother back home. They looked lost and broken in a way that had nothing to do with being prisoners. He noticed that several of the women barely ate, despite the generous portions. They would take a few bites, then stop, staring at their plates as if the food itself was accusatory. Malnutrition was obvious in their thin frames and hollow cheeks. They needed to eat more, not less. Rodriguez decided to do something about it, though he knew it might earn him criticism from fellow guards who thought any kindness to the enemy was betrayal. The next morning at breakfast, he approached Yuki's table carrying an extra carton of milk. She looked up at him with startled fear. immediately standing and bowing. Rodriguez set the milk down gently beside her tray and spoke in the slow, careful English he had been using with the prisoners. "You need to drink this. Milk is good for you, makes you strong." He pantomimed drinking and flexing his arm in an exaggerated show of strength, trying to break through the language barrier and the tension. Yuki stared at the milk, then at Rodriguez, clearly confused about why an American guard would give her extra food. In Japan, guards had been known to withhold rations as punishment or sell them on the black market for profit. Kindness from authority was not something she had been conditioned to expect. Rodriguez smiled, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his face from stern guard to young man not so different from boys she had known back home. "It's okay," he said gently. "Just milk. No trouble." Over the following days, Rodriguez made a point of showing small kindnesses to different women. He brought Emiko an extra blanket when he noticed her shivering in the cool Wisconsin evenings. He helped Keiko carry a heavy basket of laundry she was struggling with. He learned to say good morning in Japanese, "Ohayo gozaimasu," pronunciation terrible, but effort sincere. Each gesture was small, almost insignificant in itself, but the cumulative effect began to chip away at the walls the women had built around themselves. Other guards noticed, and some began following Rodriguez's example. Private First Class Tommy Chen, whose family had faced discrimination as Chinese Americans during the war, understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion based on appearance. He started bringing Japanese language newspapers to the barracks, publications printed for Japanese Americans that covered news in both languages. The women fell on these papers desperately, hungry for any information about home. October brought cooler weather to Wisconsin and a gradual thawing of the formal distance between the Japanese women and their American guards. Akiko found herself increasingly serving as translator, a role that forced her into daily contact with Captain Mitchell and various guards. Her English, rusty from years of disuse during the war, improved rapidly with constant practice. More importantly, these conversations began to reveal the profound misunderstandings both sides held about each other. One afternoon in mid-October, Akiko approached Corporal Rodriguez during his patrol of the women's compound. She had been gathering courage for days to ask the question that had been consuming her thoughts since the Hamburger incident. Rodriguez noticed her hesitant approach and stopped, giving her his full attention. He had learned that patience was essential when communicating across the language barrier and cultural divide. "Corporal Rodriguez," Akiko began, choosing her words carefully in English, "may I ask question about the food?" Rodriguez nodded encouragingly. "Of course. What's your question?" Akiko glanced back at several other women who were watching from the barracks steps, clearly having designated her as their spokesperson for this crucial inquiry. "The Hamburger Day. The big meat and fried potatoes. We thought it was special celebration. Captain Mitchell said it was normal day, just Thursday. But we need to know." She paused, struggling to articulate the question that seemed almost too enormous to ask. "When does the normal food stop? When do we go back to prisoner rations?" Rodriguez's expression shifted from friendly openness to something deeper, a sadness mixed with understanding. He had been briefed on the conditions in Japan, the starvation and deprivation that had gripped the country during the war's final year. But hearing this question from Akiko made it real in a way reports never could. These women were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the facade of plenty to end and reveal what they believed was the true nature of captivity. "Akiko," he said gently, "this is prisoner rations. This is what we feed prisoners. It doesn't stop. The Geneva Convention requires us to feed prisoners the same rations as our own soldiers. What you're eating now is what you'll keep eating until you go home." He watched her process this information, seeing the disbelief war with hope in her expression. "But why?" she finally asked, the question bursting out as if she could no longer contain it. "Why do Americans feed prisoners so much? In Japan, we were told Americans were cruel to prisoners, that captured soldiers were tortured and starved. But you give us more food than we ever had at home. Even before the war. Why? Rodriguez thought about how to answer, aware that his words might shape how these women understood everything that had happened to them. Because you're still human beings, he said simply. Being enemies in war doesn't change that. We feed you because it's the right thing to do, because no one should starve, and because maybe someday you'll remember that Americans treated you with dignity. The conversation between Akiko and Corporal Rodriguez spread through the women's barracks like ripples in still water. That evening, gathered in their usual groups after dinner, the women discussed the implications of what they had learned. The food wasn't temporary. The kindness wasn't strategic. This was simply how Americans believed prisoners should be treated. The revelation forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about everything they had been taught. Emiko sat on her bunk, holding a Red Cross package that had arrived that afternoon. It contained basic toiletries, soap, toothpaste, a comb, and small luxuries like writing paper and pencils. She ran her fingers over the items, each one a small proof of the care being extended to them despite their enemy status. When I worked at the military hospital, she said quietly, I saw how we treated Allied prisoners who were brought in wounded. They received medical care, yes, but the minimum necessary. Food rations were deliberately kept low. Officers said it was proper treatment for defeated enemies. She looked up at the other women. We were told this was how all nations treated prisoners, that the Americans and British did the same or worse to our soldiers. Yuki spoke up from across the room. My brother was captured at Saipan. We received one letter through the Red Cross saying he was alive, and in an American prison camp in Hawaii. My mother cried for weeks, certain he was being tortured or worked to death. She made offerings at the temple every day, begging for his suffering to end. She paused, emotion thickening her voice. But if they're feeding him the way they feed us, giving him the same hamburgers and abundance, then he's eating better than he ever did in the Imperial Army, better than our family ate at home. This realization opened a floodgate of questions. If America had been feeding and clothing its prisoners well throughout the war, despite the enormous expense of doing so, what did that say about American values? If American soldiers received the same generous rations, how had Japan ever hoped to win against an enemy that could afford such abundance? And most troubling of all, if American treatment of prisoners contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had claimed, what else about the war had been lies? Keiko, usually quiet during these evening discussions, spoke up with trembling intensity. They told us Americans were demons. They said American soldiers raped and murdered civilians wherever they went. They said this was why we had to fight to the death rather than surrender, because capture meant worse than death. She gestured around the barracks. We have been here over a month. Not one guard has threatened us. Not one American has harmed us. They bring us extra blankets when we're cold. They smile and try to learn Japanese words. Where are the demons they warned us about? Akiko pulled out her notebook and began writing, documenting this conversation as she had been documenting everything since the surrender. She understood that what they were experiencing here represented something important, a truth that contradicted the lies. November 5, 1945. The Red Cross delivered the first substantial batch of letters from Japan to reach Camp McCoy. Not every woman received mail. The chaos in occupied Japan made communication sporadic and unreliable. But 23 of the 47 prisoners received thin envelopes bearing news from home. Captain Mitchell distributed the letters personally, understanding the emotional weight these pieces of paper carried. The women who received them clutched the envelopes with shaking hands, almost afraid to open them and discover what had become of their families and homeland. Akiko sat on her bunk, staring at the envelope addressed in her mother's careful handwriting. The letter had been opened and read by censors, standard procedure for prisoner mail, but the fact that it had been allowed through meant it contained no security risks. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the thin paper and began reading her mother's words, written in the cramped characters that spoke of paper scarcity. The letter was dated September 20th, just weeks after the surrender. Her mother wrote that their family home in Hiroshima had been completely destroyed by the atomic bomb. Her father had been at the university when the bomb fell and had died instantly. Her younger brother had been conscripted in the final months of the war and was missing, presumed dead in the invasion of Okinawa. Her mother and younger sister had survived only because they had been evacuated to the countryside weeks before the attack. They were living in a single room in a relative's farmhouse, struggling to find enough food each day. Her mother's words were stoic, reflecting the Japanese value of enduring suffering without complaint. But between the carefully composed lines, Akiko could read her mother's devastation and despair. Across the room, Yuki read her own letter with tears streaming down her face. Her family's farm had been confiscated by occupation authorities to be redistributed as part of land reforms. Her parents and siblings were living in a refugee camp, receiving minimal rations from American relief supplies. Her father had been injured in an air raid and could no longer do heavy labor. The family was essentially destitute, with no clear path forward. Her younger sister, only 14 years old, had written a separate note tucked into her mother's letter, begging Yuki not to come home because there wasn't enough food to feed another mouth. Emiko's letter brought different but equally painful news. Her husband's family, who had never fully accepted her into their household, had declared her dead and claimed her small inheritance. With no legal standing and no property, she would return to Japan as a widow with nothing. The letter came not from family but from a former colleague at the hospital who thought she deserved to know her situation before returning. The colleague advised her to consider carefully whether returning was wise given what awaited her. The women who received letters gathered together that evening, sharing their news in voices heavy with grief and uncertainty. Those who hadn't received letters wondered if their silence meant something worse, that perhaps no one was left to write. November 22, 1945. Thanksgiving Day arrived with the first significant snowfall of the Wisconsin winter. The Japanese women woke to a transformed landscape, the compound blanketed in white that muffled sound and made everything look clean and new. Most had never seen snow before, coming from Japan's southern regions where winter meant cold rain but rarely freezing temperatures. They stood at the barracks windows watching the white flakes fall with a mixture of wonder and homesickness. This strange weather in this strange land felt like a physical manifestation of how far they had traveled from everything familiar. Captain Mitchell had spent days planning how to handle Thanksgiving. The holiday presented both an opportunity and a risk. She wanted to show the Japanese women something of American culture and tradition, but she worried about overwhelming them with abundance at a time when letters from home had made brutally clear the suffering their families endured. After consulting with Corporal Rodriguez and other guards who had developed rapport with the prisoners, she decided to proceed with a traditional Thanksgiving meal, but to pair it with explanation and context. The mess hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves created by some of the male prisoners in other sections of the camp. Long tables were set with actual tablecloths rather than the usual bare wood. When the Japanese women filed in for the midday meal, they stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed by what they saw. Each place setting included not just the usual metal tray, but actual plates, and the serving tables along the wall held more food than they had seen in one place since arriving in America. Roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening, sat on large platters. Mountains of mashed potatoes steamed beside boats of rich gravy. Sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows, a sight so strange the women initially couldn't identify what they were seeing. Green bean casserole, cranberry sauce that gleamed like jewels, fresh rolls with butter, corn on the cob, and 3 different types of pie for dessert: pumpkin, apple, and pecan. The abundance wasn't just generous, it was almost violent in its plenty, a direct assault on every expectation and every recent memory of scarcity. Akiko felt her knees weaken. She had just read her mother's letter describing survival on thin rice gruel and foraged wild plants. She had learned her family was homeless and hungry, struggling to find enough calories to survive each day. And here before her sat enough food to feed her entire extended family for a week, presented as a single meal for one day. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. How could both realities exist in the same world? Captain Mitchell stood before addressing the assembled prisoners in English, with Akiko translating. She explained that Thanksgiving was an American holiday celebrating gratitude and harvest, a tradition of gathering together to share a feast and give thanks for blessings received. She acknowledged that this abundance might be difficult, given what many had learned about conditions in Japan. The week following Thanksgiving marked a subtle but significant shift in the daily life of the Japanese women at Camp McCoy. The feast had forced them to confront the full reality of their situation, not just as prisoners in an enemy country, but as witnesses to a fundamental difference in how societies functioned. The contrast between American abundance and Japanese deprivation could no longer be dismissed as temporary or explained away by propaganda. It simply was, and they had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Emiko was the first to approach Captain Mitchell with a request that would change the dynamics of the entire camp. Speaking through Akiko as translator, she asked if some of the women could volunteer to work in the camp kitchen, not as punishment or forced labor, but as a way to learn and contribute. The request caught Mitchell off guard. Prisoners typically resisted work details, viewing them as exploitation. But Emiko explained that learning how Americans prepared such abundant meals might be valuable knowledge to take back to Japan, where food scarcity would continue for years. Mitchell agreed, and within days, a rotating group of 6 Japanese women were spending their mornings in the kitchen alongside the regular staff. The American cooks, initially wary of having enemy prisoners in their workspace, quickly discovered that these women approached cooking with an intensity and focus that put many soldiers to shame. They measured ingredients with precision, wasted nothing, and asked endless questions about techniques and proportions. Yuki became fascinated by the industrial scale of American food preparation. The kitchen received deliveries of fresh vegetables, meat, dairy products, and flour in quantities that boggled her mind. She watched as cooks prepared meals without counting individual potatoes or measuring rice grain by grain. The casual abundance of ingredients allowed for a completely different approach to cooking, focused on flavor and satisfaction rather than mere survival. She filled a notebook with observations and recipes, imagining how she might adapt these techniques for the resource-scarce environment she would return to. Keiko discovered an unexpected talent for baking. The camp baker, Sergeant William Kowalski, a second-generation Polish-American from Milwaukee, took her under his wing when he noticed her careful attention to his bread-making process. He taught her about yeast and gluten, about the science behind why dough rises and how different flours behave. She learned to make American bread, rolls, and pastries, her hands finding a meditative peace in the kneading and shaping. Kowalski spoke little, his teaching coming through demonstration rather than words, but a warm understanding developed between them that transcended language barriers. The kitchen work led to other opportunities. Several women began helping with laundry services, learning to operate the large American washing machines and dryers that seemed impossibly advanced compared to the hand-washing methods they knew. Others volunteered for cleaning details, organizing supplies, and maintaining the barracks. Each task became an opportunity to observe how Americans approached problems, how they organized systems, and how their abundance shaped their methods and expectations. The women were absorbing knowledge that would make them bridges between two very different worlds. December 12, 1945. Captain Mitchell received the telegram from Washington that she had been expecting but dreading. Official orders for the repatriation of all Japanese prisoners held in continental United States facilities. The process would begin in January and conclude by March of 1946. All prisoners would be processed through occupation authorities in Japan and released to return to their homes or what remained of them. She sat at her desk reading and rereading the orders, thinking about the 47 women who had become more than just prisoners under her watch. She called Akiko to her office that afternoon to discuss how to present the news to the other women. Akiko arrived promptly, her English now fluent enough for complex conversations. Mitchell gestured for her to sit, noting how different the young woman looked from the frightened, defiant prisoner who had arrived 3 months earlier. Akiko had gained weight, her face no longer gaunt, her eyes clearer and more focused. She carried herself with quiet confidence rather than the rigid military bearing or defeated submission she had shown in September. "I received orders today about repatriation," Mitchell began, watching Akiko's reaction carefully. The young woman's face went still, processing this information without visible emotion, a Japanese response Mitchell had learned to recognize as indicating deep feeling rather than indifference. "All Japanese prisoners will be returned home between January and March. You'll be processed through occupation headquarters in Yokohama before being released." Akiko nodded slowly, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "We knew this would come," she said quietly. "We are prisoners of war. Of course we must go home when the war is over." But her voice lacked conviction, and Mitchell heard the uncertainty beneath the formal acceptance. "How do you feel about going back?" Mitchell asked, setting aside her official role for a moment to speak as one woman to another. The question seemed to unlock something in Akiko. Her composed expression cracked slightly, revealing the turmoil underneath. "I don't know how to feel, Captain. My mother needs me. My sister needs me. Japan needs everyone who can work to rebuild. It is my duty to return." She paused, struggling to articulate something more complex. "But I also know what waits for me there. Hunger, destruction. My mother living in one room with no future. I will return to a Japan that no longer exists, to serve a cause that was built on lies, to help rebuild a country that led us into disaster." Her English became more halting as emotion affected her speech. "Here, I have learned what I could become. I speak English well now. I understand American systems. I could be useful here, could build a different life. But that would be running away from my duty, from my family, from my country." Mitchell recognized the conflict, having seen similar struggles in her own soldiers who returned from combat changed by what they had experienced. "What do the other women think?" she asked. The announcement of repatriation orders created an intense period of soul-searching among the Japanese women. Captain Mitchell had given them 2 weeks to prepare before the first transport would depart, 2 weeks that felt simultaneously too long and too short for the magnitude of the decision some of them faced. The barracks became the site of long conversations that stretched late into the night, women wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Emiko emerged as an unexpected voice of clarity during these discussions. As the oldest woman in the group and a widow with no family waiting for her return, she had less binding her to Japan than most. One evening, she gathered several of the younger women around her bunk and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had made peace with a difficult truth. "I have been thinking about duty," she began, her voice steady. "We were taught that duty means sacrifice, that we must put us, our country and family before ourselves always. But I wonder if we were taught wrong." The other women leaned in, hungry for guidance in their confusion. Emiko continued, "In Japan now, well, there is suffering. Our families need us, yes. But what can we give them if we return? We will be extra mouths to feed when food is scarce. We will be former soldiers in a defeated military, viewed with suspicion by occupation authorities and shame by our own people. We carry the taint of capture, of having survived when we were told we should choose death. What help can we be?" Yuki protested, "But we can work. We can help rebuild. We can care for family members who are struggling." Emiko nodded, acknowledging the point. "Yes, some of us can and should return for exactly those reasons. If your family needs you, if you have a place to go and a way to contribute, then returning is right. But some of us, she looked around at specific faces, some of us might serve Japan better by staying here, by learning more about America, by becoming bridges between our countries when that becomes possible. The idea that staying might be a form of service rather than abandonment was radical. It challenged everything they had been taught about loyalty and duty, but it also resonated with what they had experienced over the past 3 months. They had learned that Americans were not demons, that abundance was possible, that former enemies could show kindness. If they returned to Japan carrying only stories, those stories might be dismissed as prisoner delusions or collaboration with the enemy. But if some of them stayed, built lives in America, and eventually could facilitate understanding between the two nations, perhaps that would be a greater service. Over the following days, the women began sorting themselves into 2 groups. Those who would definitely return, either because family needed them or because they felt morally bound to share in Japan's suffering and reconstruction. And those who were seriously considering requesting permission to stay, knowing such a request was unprecedented and might be denied. January 15, 1946. The day of departure arrived with bitter cold and clear skies. Of the original 47 Japanese women who had arrived at Camp McCoy in September, 32 were preparing to board trucks that would take them to the port in San Francisco, then to ships bound for occupied Japan. 15 women had submitted formal requests to delay their repatriation, asking to be reclassified as displaced persons and considered for immigration status. The requests were working their way through bureaucratic channels in Washington with no guarantee of approval. The women who were leaving had packed their few possessions into the same bags they had carried when they arrived. Each had been given new clothes to replace their worn uniforms, civilian dresses and coats that would help them blend into post-war Japan. They also carried gifts from American POWs. Guards and staff, small things like soap, cigarettes for trading, canned food, and photographs taken during their time at camp. But the most valuable cargo they carried was invisible knowledge about how Americans lived, proof that former enemies could be kind, and hope that reconciliation was possible. Yuki stood with her packed bag at her feet, surrounded by the women who had become her family over the past 4 months. She had chosen to return despite her family's letter telling her not to come. Her father's injury meant he couldn't work the land, and her younger siblings were too young to carry the full burden. She would return and find a way to help them survive and rebuild. She had filled 3 notebooks with recipes, cooking techniques, and agricultural observations from watching Wisconsin farms through the seasons. Somehow she would adapt this knowledge to help her family. Amiko was staying. Her request for displaced person status was based on having no family to return to and professional skills that could be valuable in America. Dr. Robert Hayes, the camp medical officer, had written a letter supporting her application, stating that her nursing abilities were exceptional and that he would sponsor her continued medical training. She stood apart from those leaving, already beginning the emotional separation that her choice required. She would miss these women who had shared her journey, but she had made peace with her decision. Akiko faced the most agonizing choice. Her mother's letters begged her to return, describing the desperate situation her family faced. Her duty clearly pointed toward going home, but Captain Mitchell had offered to sponsor her application to stay, noting her language skills and cultural knowledge would make her invaluable as American-Japanese relations rebuilt. The Henderson family, the local family she had been corresponding with, had offered her housing and support. She stood between the 2 groups of women, literally unable to choose which side to join. Corporal Rodriguez approached the assembled women, his face showing the emotion he no longer tried to hide. Over 4 months, these former enemies had become people he cared about. He had watched them transform from frightened, half-starved prisoners into women with hope and purpose. The 15 women who remained at Camp McCoy after January's departure faced an uncertain transition period. Their status shifted from prisoners of war to displaced persons awaiting immigration processing, a bureaucratic limbo that could take months to resolve. Captain Mitchell worked tirelessly with Washington officials to expedite their cases, arguing that these women represented a unique opportunity to demonstrate American values of redemption and second chances. Her efforts, combined with support letters from local community members who had interacted with the women, gradually moved their applications forward through the system. By March of 1946, the first approvals began arriving. Emiko received permission to remain in the United States under sponsorship of Dr. Hayes, who had arranged for her to enter a nursing program at Madison General Hospital. She would spend 2 years in intensive training, learning American medical practices, and earning her certification. The hospital administration, initially hesitant about accepting a former enemy soldier, agreed after meeting Emiko and seeing her dedication and skill. She became the first Japanese woman veteran to enter an American nursing program, a fact that newspapers in Wisconsin covered with surprising warmth. Akiko had made her choice in the end, deciding to stay despite her mother's needs. The decision tore at her conscience, but letters from her sister convinced her it was right. Her sister wrote that their mother would be proud to know Akiko was using her education and language skills for important work, and that sending money from America would help the family more than adding another hungry mouth in Japan. Akiko found employment with the State Department's Displaced Persons Division, using her fluency in both languages to help process the thousands of Japanese Americans returning to Japan and Japanese nationals seeking to enter the United States. The other women who stayed found their own paths. Keiko continued working with Sergeant Kowalski in bakeries, eventually opening a small shop in Milwaukee that introduced Japanese-influenced pastries to curious American customers. Her mochi-filled donuts became unexpectedly popular, a fusion of cultures that embodied her own journey. She married an American veteran who had served in the Pacific, their union raising eyebrows, but also serving as a powerful symbol of reconciliation. Those who had returned to Japan faced harder roads. Letters arrived sporadically, describing the challenges of rebuilding lives in devastated cities. Yuki wrote about working her family's farm with improvised tools and limited resources, applying what she had learned about American agricultural techniques to coax better yields from exhausted soil. Her letters maintained a tone of determined optimism, refusing to complain despite obvious hardships. She never expressed regret about her choice to return, finding purpose in helping her family survive. The women who stayed maintained connections with those who had returned, creating a network that spanned the Pacific. They sent care packages filled with goods unavailable in occupied Japan: clothing, medicine, seeds for planting, and canned food. In return, they received letters describing the slow progress of reconstruction, the gradual return of hope, and the appreciation for the knowledge about America that the returning women had shared. 25 years later, on November 22, 1970, Akiko Tanaka Henderson stood before an audience at the Japanese American Cultural Center in Los Angeles. Now an American citizen with grown children, she had been invited to speak at an event commemorating the 25th anniversary of the end of World War II. Her husband, Robert Henderson, the son of the family who had first sponsored her, sat in the front row with their 2 teenage children. She carried with her the same small notebook she had clutched when she first arrived at Camp McCoy, its pages now yellowed and fragile. Her speech that day would be remembered as one of the most moving testimonies about the power of small acts to transform hatred into understanding. She spoke about the hamburger, that simple meal that had shattered everything she believed about her enemies. She described how abundance had revealed propaganda for the lies it was, how kindness from guards had challenged her assumptions about American cruelty, and how the choice to stay or return had forced 47 women to decide who they wanted to become rather than who they had been told to be. That hamburger, she told the audience, was more than just food. It was proof that everything we had been taught was wrong. It was evidence that our suffering had been based on lies, that our families had starved while our leaders told us the enemy was starving worse. But more than that, it was an act of humanity. The Americans who fed us so well, who treated us with dignity despite being their enemies, they were showing us what kind of country America could be. She shared updates about the other women, both those who had stayed and those who had returned. Emiko had become head of nursing at Madison General Hospital, training hundreds of nurses over her career and retiring with honors just 2 years earlier. Keiko's Bakery in Milwaukee had expanded to 3 locations, her fusion pastries now considered a local tradition. Of those who had returned to Japan, many had become leaders in Japanese-American friendship societies, using their experiences to build bridges between former enemies. Yuki had written just months earlier, describing how her family's farm had prospered using techniques she had learned by observing Wisconsin agriculture. Her younger sister had married and moved to America, creating another link between the two countries. The network of women who had shared that experience at Camp McCoy had grown to include their children and communities, spreading understanding across 2 generations. "We were prisoners of war," Akiko concluded, her voice strong despite her emotion. "But what we found in captivity was freedom. Freedom from lies, freedom from hatred, and freedom to choose what kind of people we wanted to be. The Americans gave us hamburgers and kindness when we expected cruelty and starvation. In doing so, they proved that redemption is possible, that enemies can become friends, and that the human capacity for compassion can overcome even the deepest divisions of war."